we had a 1-year research license. And that's kind of where the fun started, is diving into what the technology could do. And that was like the beginning of the play process.
Welcome to the Transfer Files, inside the world of federal innovation. This is your insider's look at how federal laboratories bring groundbreaking technologies to market. I'm your host, Andrea Nelson. In every episode, we'll bring you insights and expertise from throughout the world of tech transfer. This is a special episode. It's the final installment of our first season. Whether you've been with us since the beginning or you've hopped on along the way, thank you for tuning in, sharing your time, and being part of this journey. This season, we've featured guests from government, startups, incubators, venture capital firms, and more. Today, we're taking a look back at some of the highlights from this season, starting at the beginning. This year marked 50 years since the Federal Laboratory Consortium, the FLC, was formed in 1974. But really, federal technology transfer was born decades earlier. FLC Executive Director Paul Zielinski explained that the catalyst was in 1945, when Vannevar Bush, the director of the government's Office of Scientific Development, submitted a report to President Truman titled Science, the Endless Frontier.
Actually, it's a really brilliant letter. He lays out in great terms how the infrastructure that was built for this federal laboratory system that won the war should be converted over to win the peace. So changing from this whole machinery and all of the brilliant minds that were put in place to do all of these huge advances in science that really ended up on the battlefield in World War II, and changing that over to civilian applications and actually making new products that were going to make its way into the marketplace. And so it envisions this idea of technology transfer, of how we can use this system of laboratories to advance science, to make new products, to keep our leadership in the world in terms of economic development and technology development. So it's a brilliant letter. It's actually a great read if you haven't read it before. It's actually fairly long, but it lays out a great case for actually using these laboratories as a way to springboard the economy, which is technology transfer.
So technology transfer is really a natural extension of a lot of what the government has already been doing for a long time.
It is. In its core, technology transfer is actually completing the mission. It's great to do the research, but if you don't actually move that out of the bench and into something that people can use, the people in the country, the taxpayers, don't really reap the benefit and the value from their investment in research. So it actually is the core of it's the completion of that mission. It's the core of the mission to get it out there, not just to do the research, but make a difference.
And even for as natural an extension as it is, it's taken a lot of pieces to be put into place. So that leads us to the FLC being established in 1974. How did the FLC start and grow in the early years?
Great question. So it's actually an interesting one. We can go even back a little bit further. Before there was a Federal Laboratory Consortium, the Department of Defense laboratories actually got together and formed the Defense Laboratory Consortium. So it really wasn't a formal act or anything. It was just a group of people with a like mission that decided they were going to get together and they were going to start working across both the services, the Army, Navy, Air Force, as well as across the laboratories, because they're all trying to do similar things. Now, a lot of the tools we have now didn't exist back then. A lot of the things we commonly talk about in tech transfer didn't exist, but they were still trying to complete this mission. Now, for the Defense Department, it's very clear. They want to buy stuff. They're going to invent things at the laboratory, they're going to make it in the marketplace, and then they're going to bring it back in so they can procure it. But then in 1974, this is the formation of the Federal Laboratory Consortium, because at that point, the Department of Defense invited all the other agencies in. So they said, this is a great thing. Why don't we get all of the other folks involved in this thing? And that actually then you switch over from defense laboratories to just all federal laboratories, and hence the beginning of the Federal Lab Consortium. Now, it's interesting, in the early years, it's actually not a formal type of an organization. It's actually just a group of people that decided that they're going to work together and they're going to communicate with each other and try to advance this tech transfer mission. So it's actually a lot of personal commitment and endeavor that goes into forming this entity that we call the FLC.
In the early years, FLC owed its growth mostly to a handful of dedicated enthusiasts. But after several years, they got some major help when 3 key laws were passed: the Stevenson-Wydler Technology Innovation Act, the Federal Technology Transfer Act, and the Bayh-Dole Act. The Bayh-Dole Act, or the Patent and Trademark Law Amendments Act, allows universities, businesses, and nonprofits to own inventions created through federally funded research. Joe Allen, the executive director of the Bayh-Dole Coalition, was a staffer for Senator Birch Bayh, and he became instrumental to getting the Bayh-Dole Act passed.
Before Bayh-Dole, the government policy was if there was any percentage of federal funding, the invention was taken away from the inventor, taken to Washington, and made freely available, which seemed like a nice idea in 1945. But by 1970, the Japanese and the Germans were starting to eat our lunch, and the economy was in a tailspin. And we thought, well, that doesn't make any sense. There was a scarlet letter attached to government funding. Companies were not going to fund research at a university or a federal laboratory for the simple reason that the government could take the invention away, even if it's a small percentage of the research. So we actually segregated our public and private sectors. Our best and brightest minds didn't work together because government money was tainted. And what we found was, as we started looking at Bayh-Dole, we asked the Comptroller General, hey, give us a report on this. So he reported to the Senate Judiciary Committee in our hearings. There were 28,000 government inventions sitting on the shelf. Less than 5% were licensed. And that's not commercialized, that's even licensed. And we also found out, to our shock, that not a single invention had been developed into a drug from NIH funding when the government took the patent rights away. So that's why I think Senator Bayh-Dole looked at this and said, listen, this may have been well-intended, but this is a disaster.
Even with these policies, the innovation landscape is always changing, and there's no one-size-fits-all formula for successful tech transfer. We talked to guests from tech transfer offices across several agencies, including the National Institutes of Health, the Department of Veterans Affairs, and the Department of Defense, and they shed light on the nuances and developments at each of them. Here's Paige George, Technology Transfer Manager at Naval Surface Warfare Center, Panama City Division, talking about how tech transfer works at the Navy.
So we are the Naval Surface Warfare Center, part of the NAVSEA SysCom in the Department of the Navy. And our particular laboratory, our main focus areas are diving and life support systems, mine countermeasures, expeditionary warfare. So we kind of run quite the gamut, they say, from seabed to space. We handle the landing craft air cushion, which is kind of a giant hovercraft that flies over water and land. It's pretty exciting to see. You'll see it flying through the pass onto the beach. Tourists love it. We do underwater vehicles, various underwater vehicle technology, underwater vehicle security systems. The Navy has more airplanes than the Air Force. So, I mean, when you say, like, what does the Navy do from bottom of the seafloor all the way into space? So all of the SysComs, so NAVSEA, that's where the warfare centers are, where all the shipyards live. We do a lot of the underwater vehicle technologies and all of the ship maintenance. We hold all of the ships at the big shipyards. And then you have NAV Air, where they do all of the airplanes. We have NAV SUP, NAV FAC, NAV WAR. They do all the information technologies, computer systems. So it really, anything you can think of, that the Navy probably has a hand in it in some form or fashion.
And some of those, I fly on airplanes. That's a very common thing for the public, but the commercialization side within the Navy and the DoD is a little different than the other agencies. Can you kind of talk about how it works for you as opposed to some of the other federal agencies?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So when I first came to FLC, and I wasn't as familiar with T2 as I obviously am now, my initial thought about T2 is spin out. You think spin out. So we're taking federally developed technologies and licensing them to industry to support the national economy and to provide services for the American people who pay for all of the technologies that we develop in the federal government. And that's incredibly important, but that is not the only focus. And that's not the main focus in the Department of Defense. Our customer in the DoD are warfighters. We have a very specific mission in the Department of Defense. So the way that technology transfer plays in that is more of how do we develop technologies that can be dual use? We do a lot of that, but also how do we get to the non-traditional industry that really has the solutions that our warfighter needs? How can we be more agile in our ability to get technology very quickly from the marketplace into the hands of our warfighters? And so T2, in that sense, we do lots of cooperative research and development agreements. We have our traditional companies that you work with. I mean, you can probably name a bunch of them off the top of your head. Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, all these big, giant government contractors, which are fantastic. So government acquisition is great. But there are a lot of small businesses that really have the cutting edge technologies, and it's not an easy pipeline to get into the government acquisition process. So really where T2 comes into play is opening the aperture for who we can work with and how quickly we can work with them. And that's really where the DoD, I would say, kind of stands out a little bit from some of the other agencies. I don't want to say that I know for sure how all the other agencies run, but just, being in T2 for the last decade, I've kind of seen the trends, and I understand more where if I'm not licensing lots of technologies from my lab, I understand why now. Because before, you think, man, we don't really commercialize a lot of our tech. Are we not really supporting the T2 mission? It's like, no, absolutely. Because I have seen technologies that we developed at the Warfare Center get transferred to a company to complete the manufacturing or fill in the gaps. We do, dual research with this company, and then they have the final product that is then sold back to the Navy. For example, this is the example that I always like to talk about is the diver's augmented vision display system. So we took a standard Kirby Morgan diving helmet that your deep sea divers use. So this is surface applied diving where your gas is provided from a boat on topside. These guys will dive down to 300 feet of seawater, zero visibility, cold. They are not diving in the Caribbean. They are doing heavy manual labor in very turbid water, very cold water, very dark water. It's an incredibly dangerous job. And so with the David system, we have a see-through heads-up display that was inserted into this diving helmet, and it provides the ability for divers to see what they're doing. Topside can send them text messages. They can do like a 3D overlay of what they're working on. If they're changing a bolt underwater or they're doing some underwater welding, you can provide them with schematics. You can provide them with video. You can provide them anything that they need to help support the work that they're doing underwater. And that is a very advanced and very critical technology. And to get something like that from, hey, this would be a really cool idea, to the David is in most of our diving commands right now, is a huge accomplishment. And we were only able to do that because of patent license agreements, CRADAs. That is where the value is, I think, for most of the Department of Defense.
We also got perspectives from outside of the federal labs, from entrepreneurs who partner with and license from the federal labs, like Chris Campbell, CEO and founder of Simpli-Fi Automation. Simpli-Fi licensed a technology from NASA called an electronic nose.
I went to the NASA Tech Transfer website, and I probably couldn't think another thought for about 3 days. It was overwhelming how many amazing technologies were there. And my head's swimming. So I'm like, wait a minute. If I would have saw these before I started, I probably would have chose something different, because there's a lot of really cool technologies here that can change the world. But they're kind of sitting on a shelf collecting dust. So we looked through that portfolio. We saw some really cool sensors that would allow us to make our bed just a little bit better. And the one that really, really stood out to me was the NASA electronic nose. And I was like, whoa, what is an electronic nose and how can that help? But what we were looking for was a way to detect whether a patient had an accident in the bed. That way, and we were focusing on people who had either quadriplegics or someone that didn't have the ability to maybe sense those things themselves. And so when I saw this technology at NASA, it immediately clicked. I was like, wait a minute, we can use this electronic nose, which really it's a sensor that gives the capability of smell, but it gives it to an electronic system. So imagine like a dog's nose, for instance. It's pretty widely known that dogs have the ability to detect cancer on their master's breath. And the way they do that is really unique. They're looking for a smell. a particular smell that a chemical makes that's not normally there from their master. And it simply alerts them. Now, they don't know it's cancer. That's something they can be trained to do. They just know there's a difference. And so this sensor is designed to do that same thing. It's designed to smell either gases or breath and just notice a difference. And the difference is a healthy state and an unhealthy state. And so I saw this device and I was like, wait a minute, this definitely requires some digging into. And at that time, our company was pretty small. We had, I think, 16 employees total, but most of them were technicians. We had about 4 engineers. So I took the engineering team. I said, look, do you think we can take this sensor and actually build it and incorporate it into what we're doing? And the answer was no, we cannot. It's not our core competency. This requires chemistry. It's not just a straight transition from what we're doing now into what it would take to build this sensor. And so there was a little intrepidation because I didn't know if we had the capabilities. I was like, well, we're not a medical company. I don't have the credibility in that industry to really do what I want to do. So it required us kind of thinking about how we would use it. So we were introduced to it first, and that gave us a period to kind of look at it and to study it. We had a 1-year research license. And that's kind of where the fun started, is diving into what the technology could do. And that was like the beginning of the play process. So I guess the question is that, how do we get here? Well, we were an engineering company. We got introduced to NASA through a ecosystem, and it kind of opened a door to us that we didn't know about. So, yeah.
And the whole issue of not knowing what you don't know is such a hard problem to overcome. And so what, now that in 2020, or hindsight 2020, not the year 2020, how would you say that other entrepreneurs could get that kind of exposure to the fact that the whole world of technology transfer exists?
I think that in order for a company, being exposed to it is one thing, but having the confidence to actually do it is a whole nother thing. And that's where I believe really ecosystems are a must. Because if it weren't for the ecosystem introducing us to the concept, I wouldn't have known about it. But if I didn't have the support of the ecosystem, I wouldn't have done it. I would have said the risks are too high. What do I know about making a chemiresistive sensor? Relatively nothing. I knew a lot about electronics, so I knew I had the core to do it. But do I want to take that risk as a business? Do I want to make a pivot from what we're doing, which we have a plan and a clear sight to the goal? Do I want to pivot to something that would take a lot of money and a lot of time, and I don't have a high confidence of doing it? You kind of have to be a little crazy to do that. But the ecosystem is what enables that risk mitigation for me to say, okay, I may not have everything that it takes, but I do have the core competency. I can get it started. And if there's an ecosystem that can support that. So for us, what we needed was chemical engineers. We needed artificial intelligence algorithm writers. There's lots of things that were outside of our core competency that we needed. And the ecosystem's where we went to find those things. Now, at first, the ecosystem wasn't fully developed. So it required us kind of identifying some of the problems and then helping to go find the answers, find the partners who can help solve those questions.
The ecosystems Chris talked about and the importance, even the necessity of those networks was echoed again and again. Robert Hurd, the founder and managing director of Cimarron Capital Partners and Development Capital Networks, has spent decades building and nourishing entrepreneurial ecosystems on a regional level.
I'm in the economic development business on the finance side. So I represent investment resources for people trying to accomplish economic development. There are 2 basic theories. One is if you are a public agency and you have capital and you want to invest the capital, you try to force your capital into the market. You have all kinds of requirements on your capital that make it challenging for people to use your capital. But it's attractive because the public agency can say, all of our money has ended up in our jurisdiction. None of it has gone anyplace else. Now, the problem with that is it really constrains your ability to find great deals and deploy your capital. So our approach has been not to mandate so much as to select for entrepreneurs and select for investors who will are most likely to accomplish our goals, and then give them the latitude to use their own judgment and select for the best. And if they can't find the best opportunity in our jurisdiction, then they shouldn't do a deal, and they should invest their money next door in the next state. It seems counterintuitive that you would permit your public capital to go to another jurisdiction. But what we have discovered is that by selecting for people who are most likely to find great deals in your region and supporting them, that in the aggregate they will. And in the aggregate, you will have had the opportunity to invest with the best investors and not the weakest investors. The focus is to invest in people. The focus is to attract resources from the globe. The globe is your bank. The entire world is a resource for your local entrepreneurs. The technology network at the FLC and at our universities is a resource for an entrepreneur anywhere in our country. Now, you can be in Pawhuska, you can be in Tulsa, you can be in Little Rock, you can be anywhere and still have access to federal technologies. So teaching our entrepreneurs how to view the FLC as their laboratory is part of our objective, and viewing the globe as the market. So thinking globally in every respect, looking for absolutely the best opportunities, sourcing your resources from the globe in order to build your businesses locally is, I think, a formula for helping our economies grow anywhere in the country or anywhere in the world, for that matter. So much of this is about education, training, and visibility. It's just getting out there, being visible, and helping people learn how to put pieces together, where to find these resources. They're not easy to find, very fragmented. Capital resources are very, very narrowly targeted. One firm with VC in its name only does a very narrow type of deal. They're only interested in new technologies for knee surgery, and they'll look all over the world for new businesses with new technologies for knee surgery, and that's what they do. And then you got somebody else who's only interested in software, but only software that's business to business, and only software that's delivered through a SaaS model. And so they become very narrow. And so finding the investor that has the appetite for your particular deal is always a challenge and is critical. And then finding the laboratory with the technology that can serve your need. It's not straightforward. And in part because many of the technologies that are available at our website are already patented, when in fact many of the best technologies that a business needs are still in the lab. And they need to begin building the relationship with the scientist, understanding what the capabilities are of this new technology, and be poised so that when it is available, they can move quickly to commercialize it. So it's a challenge. So being out there, being visible, strutting your stuff is really the key to all this. Being really out, part of the network, being known as part of the network, being known as a resource within the network, making your assets visible to people so that they know what it is and how to use it. It's a key. Not easy. It's always been a challenge, but it is key.
Many guests also gave helpful tidbits and strategies. Michael Salgaller, a supervisory technology analysis and marketing specialist at the National Cancer Institute, shared his decades of experience with tips for effective communicating, collaborating, and marketing.
While we have what I feel is a very small team, given the challenge and given the size of NIH, it is still bigger than a lot of tech transfer offices at federal labs who have no one dedicated to analyzing the technologies, building business cases, and creating awareness, education, and outreach. So a tip and strategy would be to try to communicate at the level of your audience, and that's true of any technical sector. You're usually not speaking with somebody who has deep technical knowledge of what you're trying to discuss with them. Again, if you've done some homework, and also if you've asked them about their background, you should gain information about what level of understanding they have with the technology. Don't assume they know something. Don't be condescending. But you also want to explain things, explain abbreviations. You use abbreviations very often. The person you're speaking with may not be familiar with that. And make sure that they understand what you're communicating, because making the other person or persons feel stupid is not a good basis of a relationship. So that's one thing, is to communicate at the level of your audience. Get to know what they're interested in before you pitch anything. You probably have a lot of exciting technologies. Find out if the person that you're talking to is interested in licensing. If their strategic interests don't include licensing, then there's really no reason to bring that up. So do a little bit of your homework. It'll also impress your audience. When you sit down and they start to say, well, let me introduce you to my company, you can indicate, well, we've looked at your website, or we've looked at some of the information that's available on different types of subscription sites. And so they will be impressed that you've done a little homework on them. And they'll also appreciate the fact that you're not going to take up their time going from the very beginning.
And I'm curious, because you're approaching those kinds of conversations knowing that the person on the other side might speak a different language, might not know all the acronyms. Are there adjustments that you find yourself making as the listener then when they respond, where you're adapting, or are there tips for adapting to the kind of language that may be brought to you? Does that make sense?
Yeah, so a couple things are to check in with them, close the communication loop. Simply say, did I answer your question? Or did you understand my explanation? Sometimes they don't, but they're too embarrassed, either that they don't know and they feel they should, or they don't want to embarrass you. So that's something very basic that you can ask them. And that gets conversation off to a good start. You can also ask them if they've ever worked with your particular federal agency before. Regardless of what federal agency you're with, you have unique opportunities and challenges. And so someone familiar with working with you, maybe you don't have to explain how royalty rates are determined or how a license application is submitted. So ask them questions and I always try to avoid using the phrase, of course you know that. I even say National Institutes of Health instead of course you know that NIH stands for the National Institutes of Health, because again, you don't want to make your audience feel stupid. And if they don't know something and you said, of course you know that, not a good way to establish a good relationship.
There were so many more gems and fascinating guests. You can listen to them all on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, and other podcast platforms. Thanks again to all of our guests for sharing their time, knowledge, and insights. And thanks to you for listening and spreading the word about the podcast. Thank you also to our producer and digital marketing manager, Carly Dunnell, graphics manager, Danny Batchelor, web content and systems manager, Jess Klein, and the FLC staff and community for your support. We're taking a break for the holidays, and then we'll be back in 2025 for a whole new season of experts and conversations. We'll see you soon for another Transfer Files Tuesday. Thanks for tuning in to the Transfer Files, your insider's look at federal tech transfer. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay connected for more episodes exploring how hundreds of government laboratories and countless industry partners are driving innovations that shape our lives.